Airport security pulled a black CEO aside for extra screening, not realizing he managed the airline's $8 billion fuel contract. What happened next grounded their arrogance for good. They thought detaining him would make them look powerful. They didn't realize the man they singled out literally keeps their planes in the air. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on a badge. Malcolm's phone buzzed at 5 in the morning, rousing him from a dream of contrails and boardrooms. He sat up in bed and stretched, the dim light painting his bedroom in soft gray hues. Without lingering in the warmth of his sheets, he swung his legs over the side and stood, feeling the polished wood floor under his feet. He had a flight to catch, and the knowledge filled him with a disciplined urgency. On the dresser lay the crisp suit he had chosen the night before, a dark blue jacket and trousers that he believed projected calm authority. He crossed to the window and drew back the curtains, taking in the stillness of the street. The city outside would soon wake, but for now only the occasional headlights traced silent paths. Malcolm walked to the kitchen and brewed coffee, inhaling the rich aroma that always reminded him of mornings spent studying as a young man, determined to carve a path through a world that had not been built with him in mind. On the kitchen table, his leather briefcase sat ready, the latest draft of the fuel contract carefully tucked inside. He dialed his assistant. "Nolan?" he said when the call connected, his voice low but alert. "Are you awake? Remember, we need to be at the terminal early." Nolan's voice responded with a sleepy chuckle. "Yes, sir. I've got the presentation slides on my tablet and we'll meet you there. Don't worry, I'm on it." Malcolm smiled faintly, reassured by the reliability in his friend's tone. As he dressed, he reflected on the road that had led him here. Growing up, he had listened to his grandfather recount stories of perseverance in the face of barriers, stories that had become guides whenever he encountered skepticism or thinly veiled prejudice. Those memories buoyed him as he slid his tie into place and slipped the knot just so. He glanced at the framed photograph of his family on the hallway wall before grabbing his briefcase and keys. Outside, the crisp morning air cleared his thoughts. The driver, Charles, waited by the car, a solid figure in a black coat. "Good morning, Mr. Rowan," Charles greeted, opening the door. Malcolm nodded. "Morning, Charles. Let's make our way to Ravenport." The engine hummed to life, and the vehicle glided through sleeping neighborhoods toward the highway. Traffic was light. As the sun began to lighten the horizon, Malcolm reviewed the contract one more time, murmuring to himself the key points he wanted to emphasize during the meeting. He felt the familiar mixture of confidence and responsibility. The contract represented $8 billion of fuel, but more importantly, it represented the livelihoods of countless employees in his company and the airline. He closed the folder and stared out the window as buildings gave way to the expansive structure of Ravenport International Airport. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was already humming with activity. Announcements chimed overhead, and the scent of coffee and jet fuel mingled in the air. Malcolm thanked Charles, took his bag, and stepped through the automatic doors. The polished floors reflected the movement of travelers and staff. A young male ticketing agent looked up and offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Rowan, welcome," he said. Malcolm returned the smile, feeling a momentary ease. He handed over his identification and ticket, exchanged a few cordial words, and continued toward the security area. As he approached the checkpoint, he noticed two officers whispering to each other and glancing in his direction. He brushed off the flicker of unease that touched his mind. Years of navigating professional spaces had taught him to read body language, but he refused to jump to conclusions. This was, he reminded himself, a routine flight, a standard day. He checked his watch and quickened his pace, eager to reach the gate and mentally run through his presentation one more time. In that moment, Malcolm's thoughts remained on fuel prices and contract clauses, not on suspicion. His trust in the system remained intact. He did not yet know that a few seconds of scrutiny would swell into a cascade of consequences. The faint tension in the officer's shoulders and the whispered exchange behind their hands were just minor notes in the symphony of the busy terminal, nothing more. He inhaled deeply, feeling prepared for the day ahead, confident that experience and preparation would guide him through. He was unaware that a simple boarding process would reveal hidden biases that could cost millions. FF. Malcolm set his briefcase on the conveyor belt with a practiced motion, sliding off his jacket and placing it neatly in a plastic bin. He stepped through the metal detector, the machine's soft hum filling his ears. When he emerged on the other side, ready to collect his belongings, Officer Grant held up his hand. "Sir, please step over here," the officer said, gesturing to a partitioned area. Grant's expression was impassive, but his tone left little room for discussion. "Is there a problem?" Malcolm asked, maintaining a calm demeanor as he removed his shoes and belt per instruction. Officer Grant shook his head. "Random check," he replied, though his eyes lingered on Malcolm's face as if memorizing features. Another officer, Price, approached, his gaze flicking between the identification card in his hand and Malcolm himself. Price squinted at the photograph. "When was this taken?" he asked, tilting the card under the fluorescent lights. 2 months ago," Malcolm answered evenly. "I renewed my license recently." Price frowned as if the answer dissatisfied him. Without a word, he held the card up to Grant, who nodded and muttered something Malcolm could not hear. A subtle shift in their posture suggested they were reading more into the situation than a simple document check. Behind him, the line lengthened. A man in a gray suit rolled his eyes and checked his watch, then looked away when Malcolm met his gaze. Malcolm felt a flush of heat rise in his chest, not from guilt but from the familiar sting of being singled out without explanation. He reminded himself to breathe, to remain courteous. "Gentlemen, I have a flight to Ferndale," he said. "If there's an issue, I'd like to resolve it quickly." Grant responded by instructing him to empty his pockets and spread his arms for a pat-down. Malcolm complied, placing his wallet, phone, and keys in the bin. He glanced toward Nolan, who was waiting near the seating area, and raised his eyebrows in silent communication. Nolan read the worry and hurried toward the gate agents to inform them of the delay. Meanwhile, Price ran a wand detector over Malcolm's arms and legs, pausing intentionally at his pockets as if expecting something to appear out of thin air. The wand beeped, though Malcolm knew it was responding to the small metal clasp inside his belt loops. "You travel often, sir?" Grant asked, not looking up. "Yes," Malcolm replied. "I oversee fuel contracts for Aerolux. My company ensures your planes have the fuel they need." The officer's expression did not change. "Title doesn't mean you skip protocol," he muttered, but the way he said it suggested that Malcolm's position might have been why he felt the need to assert authority. Passengers whispered to each other. A young father holding his son shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm straightened his shoulders. He wanted to tell the officers that their suspicion was misplaced, to remind them that he had passed through this checkpoint dozens of times without incident. Instead, he chose not to provoke. "If there's confusion, we can verify my identity with the airline," he suggested. Price's jaw tightened. "Please remain in the designated area until we clear you," he said, implying that additional questioning was forthcoming. As minutes dragged on, Malcolm's sense of dignity began to erode. He was a man accustomed to respect, not flattery but professional courtesy. Having strangers stare at him while officers turned his personal items over with gloved hands was humiliating. Yet he held his tongue, aware that anger could confirm whatever stereotypes these officers harbored. Unknown to him, their suspicion stemmed from a misinterpreted note in the security system, a flag that had no relation to him. He could not know that his calm would soon be tested by a cascade of assumptions. He remained unaware that his dignity would be tested by the very industry he kept afloat. Barefoot on the cold tile, Malcolm felt the chill seep through his composure. The screening had stretched far beyond what any traveler would consider reasonable. Officers continued to inspect his belongings with methodical precision, as if expecting to find contraband hidden in the folds of his documents. He glanced at the monitor above the gate, where his flight number began to blink as boarding time approached. "Gentlemen," he said, struggling to keep his tone even, "I manage an important contract. If I miss this flight, thousands of employees could be affected. This needs to be resolved." Officer Grant did not answer. Instead, Supervisor Harris appeared, his presence adding a new level of authority to the encounter. Harris was a heavy-set man with a clipped mustache, his stern expression a mask carved from years of enforcing rules. Harris held a tablet displaying a list of names. "Your name has been flagged," he stated without greeting. "There have been reports of identities being used fraudulently on this route." Malcolm blinked, stunned. "My identification is legitimate. You can verify with Aerolux or Azure Skies," he said, raising his chin slightly. Harris pursed his lips. "We will do that, but until we complete the check, you stay here." The words felt like shackles. Malcolm looked toward the gate where airline staff were beginning to scan boarding passes. Each beep of their scanner was a small measure of time slipping away. The murmur of passengers behind him grew louder. A male traveler near the front of the line whispered to his companion, "This is ridiculous. They're holding up the line because of him." Malcolm heard it and felt a mix of shame and anger flare inside him. He turned back to the officers. "I'd like to contact Calvin Dunn, the CFO of Aerolux," he said. "He can vouch for me." Grant shook his head. "No calls until we're done." The denial sounded final. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Patience had always been his armor, but cracks formed as he imagined the consequences of missing the flight. He remembered his grandfather teaching him to hold his head high in the face of disrespect, but he also remembered his grandfather's hands trembling after being turned away from a job decades ago for reasons he could not control. Nolan returned, a gate agent named Simon Reed in tow. "This is Mr. Rowan," Nolan said firmly. "He's a valued client." Simon looked from Malcolm to the officers, recognizing him immediately. "I can confirm his identity," Simon offered, but Harris cut him off. "We can't just take your word. There's a process." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement from a judge. Malcolm noticed his heartbeat quicken. Each second seemed to carry the weight of an hour. The room around him, the conveyor belts, the metal detector, the traveling men, blurred as his focus narrowed on the officers' faces. The combination of suspicion and indifference there was infuriating. He wondered if his skin tone had turned a routine check into a prolonged interrogation. The voice on the intercom announced the final call for his flight. His chest tightened. He had always believed that professionalism and patience would overcome prejudice, but in that moment he felt powerless. He considered raising his voice, demanding to speak to a higher authority, but a deeper instinct told him that any sign of frustration might confirm their bias. He squeezed his eyes shut briefly, then opened them, determined to endure. He could not know that this moment would ripple beyond his own missed flight to alter the course of the airport's future. Little did he know that this delay would reshape the destiny of Ravenport International. The commotion at the checkpoint caught Calvin Dunn's attention as he hurried through the concourse. Nolan's frantic call had sent him rushing from his office, security badge in hand, ignoring the bewildered looks of colleagues he passed. When he reached the area, he saw Malcolm, shoes off, standing with his hands by his sides, his jaw set in a line of dignified frustration. Officers and passengers alike turned as Calvin approached. "What is going on here?" Calvin demanded, his voice echoing over the low hum of conversation. Supervisor Harris stepped forward, surprise briefly flashing in his eyes at the sight of the airline's chief financial officer. "This man was flagged," Harris began. "We're following protocol." Calvin cut him off. "Do you know who he is? He manages the fuel that keeps our fleet in the air. Every gallon that goes into our planes passes through his decisions." Officer Grant's face paled. He glanced at Malcolm, then at Calvin, and then at the tablet that had guided their actions. Simon Reed took the opportunity to lean over and check the flagged note. "Supervisor," Simon said, lowering his voice so only the officials could hear, "the reference number doesn't match Mr. Rowan's profile. It looks like a misprint in the database." Harris's jaw tightened. He flicked his finger across the tablet, frustration darkening his features. Malcolm remained silent, his eyes locked on Calvin and Harris as they spoke. He watched the realization dawn in the officers' posture. Their shoulders sagged slightly, and the rigid set of their jaws loosened. The crowd around them shifted, some men murmuring to each other. The sense of tension began to dissipate, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that a mistake had been made. Calvin turned back to Malcolm. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice softer. "They flagged you in error. We'll get you to the gate immediately." Malcolm nodded but offered no smile. "The flight is boarding," he replied evenly. "We need to hurry." Calvin nodded and motioned to the officers to release him. Harris fumbled with the bins, pushing Malcolm's belongings forward. Just as Malcolm slipped on his shoes and gathered his briefcase, the intercom crackled. "Final boarding call for Flight 237 to Ferndale is now closed. The gate is shutting down." The words stabbed the air. All eyes turned to the large windows where the jet bridge was being retracted. The plane began to roll back slowly, its engines winding up. A low murmur of disbelief swept through the onlookers. Nolan cursed under his breath, then caught himself, glancing at Malcolm with concern. Malcolm's throat tightened. He stood frozen for a moment, watching the aircraft that carried his carefully laid plans taxi away. The irony struck with almost physical force. He was the man responsible for negotiating the fuel contract that would power that very plane, yet he had been kept from boarding it because of a data error and an officer's bias. Calvin's hands balled into fists. "This is unacceptable," he said, turning to Harris. "Do you have any idea what this has cost us?" Harris stammered, starting to apologize, but Calvin held up his hand. "We'll discuss this later. Right now, I need to get Mr. Rowan to his meeting." But there was no next flight for hours. The opportunity to arrive in Ferndale in time had vanished with the departing plane. Malcolm exhaled slowly, controlling the urge to shout. He felt both anger and an odd sense of detachment, as if watching himself from a distance. He gathered his papers, his movements precise and deliberate. Around him, passengers shook their heads or looked away, unsure whether to offer sympathy or avoid eye contact. He met Nolan's gaze and saw the same mix of shock and fury reflected there. The moment was drenched in irony and heaviness, not lost on anyone who understood the situation. The officers mumbled apologies, but the harm had been done. Malcolm and Calvin turned away, their faces composed but their minds racing through the implications of the delay. The corridor seemed longer than before, each footstep echoing the absurdity of what had happened. The gravity of the error was sinking in, along with the knowledge that something more insidious than incompetence had played a role. The irony of being denied entry to a plane powered by his own deals hung thick in the air. Malcolm's shoes clicked softly on the polished floor as he followed Calvin to a secluded seating area. The adrenaline that had fueled his composed responses drained away, leaving behind a hollow ache and a simmering anger. He sank into a chair, placed his briefcase beside him, and stared at his phone as messages flashed across the screen. Board members wanted updates. Colleagues asked if he had landed. A client wondered about the meeting time. Calvin sat opposite, his brow furrowed. "We'll reschedule," he said, trying to sound optimistic. "Spencer Drake will understand. We'll explain the situation." Malcolm nodded but knew that delays in billion-dollar negotiations often allowed doubt to creep in. "We can't pretend this is nothing," he replied. "It's a loss of time and a loss of respect." Nolan joined them, his face flushed with frustration. "They won't even admit it was discrimination," he said. "They just say it was protocol." Malcolm glanced at Nolan. "We need the incident report and the footage. If we're going to confront this, we must base it on facts, not emotions." He pulled out his phone and dialed Victor Lang, the airport's head of operations. "Victor," he said when the man answered, "I need your help. I want a copy of the report on this morning's security delay." Victor sounded flustered. "Malcolm, I'm sorry for what happened. We'll conduct an internal review." His tone, however, was more concerned about public perception than personal accountability. Malcolm hung up and rubbed his forehead. He felt the weight of expectations pressing down on him. His shareholders expected him to stay calm. His community expected him to speak out. His own sense of self demanded justice. He called Ethan his mentor. "Ethan," he began. his voice betraying fatigue. Have you ever been in a situation where silence felt like betrayal? Ethan's voice on the other end was calm. Many times, he said. Silence can protect you in the short term, but change doesn't come from being quiet. You have influence. Use it wisely. Malcolm closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He pictured younger men without his resources, enduring similar situations and having no recourse. Nolan leaned forward. We should speak to a lawyer, he suggested. This isn't just an inconvenience. It has financial implications, and it sends a message. Malcolm hesitated. He had always avoided litigation when possible, believing in negotiation over confrontation. But this time, negotiation had been rendered useless by someone else's bias. All right, he said. Find an attorney who understands the aviation sector. We need to know our options. The hum of conversations around them faded into the background as Malcolm organized his thoughts. He wrote a list of immediate actions. Gather evidence, document the delay, reschedule the meeting, and prepare a statement. He caught sight of his reflection in the window, seeing not just a tired executive but a man at a crossroads. He thought about his younger self, told to accept unfair treatment silently to avoid trouble. He thought about his responsibility to those who looked up to him. As he sat there, anger transformed into resolve. He could allow the incident to pass quietly, chalking it up to an unfortunate error, or he could stand up and demand accountability, risking backlash. He decided that the discomfort of confrontation was a small price to pay for dignity. He looked at Nolan and Calvin. We'll move forward, he said. But we're not going to let this go unnoticed. Calvin nodded. We're with you, he said. Nolan pulled out a notebook and began to jot down tasks. The plane he had missed had been just one flight, but Malcolm sensed that this episode would lead him onto a much longer path. A path that would require courage and foresight, that would test his patience and his conviction, but that might also catalyze change far beyond his own experience. The missed flight had been replaced by a far larger journey toward justice. The conference room was quiet except for the scratching of pens and the occasional rustle of paper. Malcolm sat with Jared Cross, the attorney, and Nolan at a long table, the blinds drawn to keep prying eyes away. Papers were spread out, copies of the incident report, printouts of comments on news articles, and notes from calls with stakeholders. It had been days since the airport incident, and Malcolm's decision to speak up had crystallized into a plan. Jared adjusted his glasses and tapped a legal pad. If we decide to go public, we need to be precise, he said. No inflammatory language, just the facts in order. That will establish credibility. Malcolm nodded. I don't want to sensationalize. I want to highlight what happened and why it's part of a larger problem. Nolan scrolled through his tablet, pulling up talking points they had drafted. Eldon is waiting to hear from us, he said. He wants to make sure he gets it right. Malcolm picked up his phone and dialed Eldon's number. When the journalist answered, his voice was warm but professional. Malcolm, thanks for trusting me, Eldon began. Malcolm recounted the details, his tone measured. He described the officer's suspicion, the refusal to allow him to make a call, the moment the plane pulled away. Eldon listened, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. It wasn't just about me, Malcolm concluded. It's about procedures that let bias thrive. Eldon promised to craft the piece carefully and to include perspectives from aviation experts. As the article went live, Malcolm sat at his desk and refreshed his browser. The headline was straightforward. The story recounted events without exaggeration, yet the comments section quickly filled with conflicting opinions. Some readers expressed outrage that a successful CEO could be treated so poorly, while others accused him of making a fuss. Malcolm scrolled through, feeling a mix of gratitude for the support and disappointment at the backlash. He glanced at Jared. This was expected, the attorney said. Public discourse always divides. His phone rang. It was Calvin. Just read the article, Calvin said. We back you. The board is anxious, but I told them this needed to be public. Malcolm exhaled. Any word about other suppliers? He asked. Calvin hesitated. There is chatter. Ronan mentioned that a competitor approached Spencer. It might just be posturing. Malcolm frowned. Posturing or not, we have to be ready, he replied. He set up meetings with partners to reassure them of his company's stability and his unwavering focus on the business. He also called Gabriel Sutter, an old friend adept in communications. I need help framing this, Malcolm admitted. It can't be about my ego. It has to be about systemic change. Gabriel's laughter was a low rumble. You're the least ego-driven executive I know. We'll craft a narrative around solutions. Press conference. Malcolm agreed. Yes, but I want training and policy change at the center. They scheduled a conference and invited industry leaders. That evening, Nolan handed Malcolm a list of speaking invitations. You're being asked to sit on panels and give interviews, he said. People want your insight. Malcolm rubbed his temples. We'll choose carefully. I want to make sure we're effective, not just visible. Jared reminded him, every word you say could influence the negotiations. Be clear about your priorities. As he lay in bed that night, Malcolm stared at the ceiling. He had chosen to risk more than his own comfort. He had chosen to risk his business's reputation to pursue fairness. He thought of how his grandfather had once been denied work because of his complexion and how that story had pushed him to excel. Now, he was pushing not just for himself but for the nameless travelers who would never have a platform. He knew this path would be fraught with resistance, misinterpretations, and perhaps lost contracts. But he felt in his bones that silence would be a betrayal of everything he had become. He understood that fighting for dignity also meant risking everything he had built. Azure Sky's logistics headquarters had always felt like a second home to Malcolm. The glass walls, the hum of computers, and the scent of fresh coffee were familiar comforts. Yet as he walked toward the executive conference room, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's climate control. Whispered rumors about Ronan Holt's maneuvering had reached him, and betrayal is a colder thing than air conditioning. Inside, Ronan sat at the far end of the table, his tie impeccably knotted, fingers tapping lightly on a folder. He stood when Malcolm entered. Good morning, he said, voice neutral. Malcolm didn't waste time. Ronan, I've heard that you've reached out to Aerolux about alternative fuel suppliers. He began, hands resting on the back of a chair. Ronan's eyes flicked to the side, just for a second, before settling back on Malcolm's face. I was exploring possibilities, he replied. Given the situation, we need contingencies. Contingencies, Malcolm repeated, his tone calm but firm. We should be supporting each other, not undermining. You know that my advocacy doesn't threaten the contract's viability. It strengthens our reputation. Ronan crossed his arms. Not everyone sees it that way. Some think your activism is drawing unnecessary attention. I merely suggested that we could step back if Aerolux prefers less controversy. Malcolm inhaled slowly, choosing his words. Stepping back or stepping in to take advantage? We're a team, Ronan. Dividing us plays into the hands of those who would prefer we stay silent about inequities. Ronan's jaw tightened. I'm looking out for the company, he insisted. If the board loses confidence, Malcolm cut him off. The board doesn't lose confidence because we stand up for what's right. They lose confidence when internal leaders try to exploit a crisis. The tension in the room thickened. For a moment, neither man spoke. Malcolm broke the silence. Ronan, I'm calling a meeting with the full board. We'll discuss this openly. If there's skepticism about our direction, we'll address it together. Backchannel deals erode trust. Ronan's shoulders shifted, a subtle sign of discomfort. Fine, he said quietly. Perhaps I misjudged. I'll accept the board's decision. After Ronan left, Calvin entered the room. That looked intense, he observed, raising an eyebrow. Malcolm nodded. It was necessary. We can't allow opportunism to fracture us. Transparency is the only way. Calvin agreed. I've scheduled the board meeting. We need to reaffirm our values and commitment to both ethics and profitability. Nolan, standing just outside, scribbled notes. We'll need data to show the benefits of our stance, he said. Ever the organizer. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with tension. Malcolm felt the weight of eyes on him, supportive and skeptical alike. He focused on preparing, gathering evidence of how ethical practices had improved their brand, and anticipating questions about profitability. He rehearsed responses in his office, pausing to adjust his tone when he imagined hostility. The morning of the meeting, he dressed with care, choosing a tie his grandfather had given him, one with subtle stripes. It was a reminder of roots and lessons learned. As he walked into the boardroom, he didn't feel anger toward Ronan anymore. He felt disappointment mingled with determination to turn this challenge into an opportunity to strengthen their collective resolve. The battle he now faced required strategy, empathy, and unwavering adherence to the principles he had espoused publicly. The fight shifted from the checkpoint to the boardroom, where loyalties were murkier than ever. They questioned him like a suspect, unaware his signature fuels every jet in their fleet. If you believe power without awareness is just ignorance in uniform, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't fly, coach. The boardroom's polished table reflected the faces of the men seated around it, each expression a mosaic of concern, curiosity, and calculation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city skyline, but the scenery did nothing to ease Malcolm's tension. He placed his hands on the table, feeling the cool surface steady him. Calvin sat to his right, his expression resolute. Ronan sat further down, eyes lowered, his earlier defiance replaced by a guarded silence. Calvin opened the meeting, giving a concise review of the events at Ravenport and the subsequent media attention. He emphasized that the issue at hand went beyond personal inconvenience. It reflects on our company's values, he said. We stand for fairness in all our dealings, whether with customers or employees. Heads nodded around the table. Malcolm took a breath and began to speak. I want to recount what happened and why it matters, he said, looking each board member in the eye. He spoke of the officer's suspicion, his inability to contact a colleague, the missed flight. He referenced the security footage which they had all been invited to view. He described the humiliation of being treated as a threat in an industry he supported. He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet intensity of his words filled the room. He then shifted to solutions. We have an opportunity to lead, he said. We can work with Aerolux to implement bias training at checkpoints. We can form a joint oversight committee to review incidents and recommend improvements. And we can include clauses in our contract that hold all parties accountable for equitable treatment. Lucas Finch leaned forward. Those measures sound expensive and could set expectations for future contracts, he cautioned. Malcolm nodded. They do have costs, but the cost of doing nothing is greater: loss of trust, lawsuits, reputational damage. Calvin supported him. Clients are watching. They care about how we respond. Ethical leadership attracts partners who share our values. Ronan cleared his throat, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because he felt obligated to speak. We also have to consider that Spencer might choose a cheaper supplier, he said. Malcolm responded calmly. Price is not our only competitive advantage. Our reliability, safety record, and integrity are. Those qualities are why Aerolux chose us initially. The discussion stretched on. Questions were raised about metrics for success, potential backlash, and how to communicate these initiatives to investors. Malcolm answered each as best he could, sometimes deferring to Calvin for financial specifics. Nolan, seated at the back, passed him notes with data about the positive impact of diversity training on operations. Gradually, he sensed the room shifting. Skeptical eyes softened. Concerns turned into constructive suggestions. What had started as a potential vote of no confidence became a brainstorming session on how to operationalize the values they espoused. At last, the chairman called for a vote. The decision was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The board supported Malcolm's continued leadership and the proposed initiatives. Relief washed over him, though he kept his expression measured. He thanked the board for their trust and reaffirmed his commitment to ensuring both profitability and progress. As the meeting adjourned, he caught Ronan's eye. The other man looked away, then back again and offered a tentative nod. In the hallway, Malcolm extended his hand. We move forward together, he said. Ronan clasped it. Agreed, he replied, his voice subdued but sincere. Malcolm knew that trust would need rebuilding, but the first step had been taken. Walking back to his office, he felt the fatigue set in, but along with it came a sense of accomplishment. He had navigated a minefield of egos and fears without compromising his principles. Malcolm's calm determination forced even his adversaries to reconsider their motives. The conference room at Aerolux headquarters was sleek and modern, its walls decorated with aerial photographs of fictional destinations serviced by the airline. Malcolm and Calvin sat on one side of the polished table, opposite Aerolux's CEO Spencer Drake and his legal advisor. Bottles of water and notepads sat neatly before each man. For a moment, the scene might have seemed like any other business negotiation, but the undercurrent of tension made the air feel thicker. First, Spencer began, his hands folded neatly, I want to apologize for the incident at Ravenport. It was unacceptable. His tone was sincere, yet his eyes darted to the lawyer next to him as if measuring the legal implications of every word. Malcolm inclined his head. Thank you. Your apology is appreciated. But apologies don't fix systems. We need measures to ensure this doesn't happen again. To anyone. Spencer shifted in his seat. We have shareholders who are concerned about publicity, he said. They expect us to handle issues without drawing excessive attention. Calvin leaned forward. Excessive attention results from cover-ups and inaction, he said. Transparency and change maintain trust. Malcolm pulled out a document outlining proposed reforms. We suggest mandatory bias training for all security personnel, a clear reporting process for passengers, and clauses in our fuel contract tying performance bonuses to adherence to equity standards. Spencer's advisor whispered in his ear, and Spencer frowned. Including such clauses in a commercial contract is unusual. It might set a precedent. Malcolm met his gaze. Perhaps, but good precedents lead to improvements. Our partnership can be more than transactional. It can set a standard for others to follow. The room fell silent as Spencer considered the proposal. The hum of the building's air conditioning filled the pause. After what felt like an eternity, Spencer spoke. What if we agree to the training and oversight but keep the contract language focused on fuel metrics? The committee's recommendations can be separate. Malcolm exchanged a glance with Calvin. It wasn't everything he wanted, but it was a start. He nodded slowly. If there's a written commitment to implement training and accountability, and we can publicly discuss the progress, that could work. Spencer leaned back. We will ask that you delay further public commentary until after we sign. The board is sensitive to press coverage. Malcolm felt a twinge of discomfort. He did not like the idea of staying silent, but he also knew that securing the reforms was critical. He glanced at Calvin, who gave a subtle nod. We can pause public statements temporarily, Malcolm conceded, provided the commitment to transparency is included. The lawyer scribbled notes. After further discussion, they reached an agreement. The fuel contract was renewed, with an addendum describing the Joint Task Force on bias training and reporting. Malcolm picked up the pen and signed, the ink cool and smooth across the paper. He watched Spencer sign as well, binding the two companies not just in commerce but in a shared mission. As they left the room, Calvin clapped Malcolm on the shoulder. We did it, he said quietly. Malcolm smiled, though his mind churned with what lay ahead. Signing an agreement was one thing, ensuring its execution was another. Back at Azure Skies, he gathered his team and relayed the news. Nolan raised an eyebrow. So we have a committee, and you're agreeing not to speak publicly. Malcolm nodded. For now. But we negotiated a clause that allows us to report progress. We're not muzzled. We're strategic. That evening, alone in his office, Malcolm watched the sunset cast a golden glow over the city. The sky shifted through shades of orange and pink, reminding him of the importance of gradual transitions. He felt relief but not complacency. There were still skeptics to convince, deadlines to meet, and training programs to design. But there was also progress, a step taken toward embedding fairness into the very contracts that fueled the industry. He realized that victory required vigilance, not complacency. The first meeting of the Oversight Committee took place in a conference room overlooking the runways of Ravenport International. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, planes took off and landed, their movements steady and reassuring. Inside, the atmosphere was a mixture of cautious optimism and wary curiosity. Representatives from Azure Skies, Aerolux, and the airport authority sat around the table, including Supervisor Harris, Jared Cross, Victor Lang, and a young security officer named Derek. Jared distributed an agenda outlining topics such as bias training curriculum, incident reporting processes, and metrics for measuring progress. Malcolm opened the meeting with a few words. "We're here to turn commitments into action," he said, scanning the faces around him. "We need honest discussion and tangible steps." Harris, who had previously enforced the rules that delayed Malcolm, nodded tersely. His rigid posture was gone. He now leaned slightly forward, pen ready. The committee reviewed training modules developed by external consultants. The modules included scenarios, reflective exercises, and discussions on unconscious bias. Some officers expressed skepticism. "We already follow the rules," one said. "Why do we need this?" Derek raised his hand. "Because rules don't cover everything," he replied. "We react to people based on instinct. The training helps us question those instincts." Harris glanced at Derek, perhaps surprised at the junior officer's insight. Malcolm watched the exchange, feeling a flicker of hope. He shared his story again, not to center himself but to illustrate how easily routine can morph into prejudice. He described the feeling of being considered a threat, despite his contributions to the industry. As he spoke, he saw understanding flicker in a few faces. He also saw resistance in others, a reminder that change would not be universal or immediate. Outside the airport, Malcolm continued to advocate. He spoke at conferences, emphasizing that safety and fairness were not opposing values. He reached out to executives at other airports, encouraging them to adopt similar oversight committees. Some responded enthusiastically. Others demurred, citing budgets or politics. Eldon's articles documented both progress and setbacks, keeping the public informed without sensationalism. Gabriel arranged interviews where Malcolm discussed solutions rather than rehashing the indignity. In the evenings, Malcolm walked the terminals, observing interactions. He noticed Officer Grant greeting passengers with a nod rather than a scowl, and Harris offering explanations instead of commands. On one occasion, a traveler approached Malcolm and thanked him for his advocacy, saying he felt safer knowing someone cared about fair treatment. Malcolm's heart swelled at such moments. Each small sign of progress felt like a light pushing back against shadows. Nolan compiled quarterly reports, charting a decrease in complaints and an increase in positive feedback. Calvin observed that staff morale at Aerolux improved when employees felt respected, which translated into smoother operations. Data gave the committee leverage to continue and expand the training program. However, Malcolm remained vigilant. He knew that leadership changes or shifting priorities could erode the progress. At a meeting, he proposed embedding the Oversight Committee's structure into future contracts, making it harder to dismantle. He also pledged funds from Azure Skies to support training at smaller regional airports. "We have benefited from this process," he told the board. "We have a responsibility to share it." His proposal was met with nods. The initiative was a way of paying forward the lessons learned, of turning a personal struggle into widespread benefit. The faces of young men he met along the way, officers, students, travelers, stayed with him as he worked. One afternoon, he sat quietly in the terminal, the same terminal where months earlier he had been humiliated. Now he heard laughter, polite instructions, and the hum of conversation. The atmosphere felt transformed. The echoes of suspicion had been replaced by a murmur of respect. He smiled slightly, not out of smugness but out of gratitude. The work was far from finished, but the progress was undeniable. He rose, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the exit, ready for the next meeting, the next challenge. The terminal that once echoed with whispers of suspicion now buzzed with conversations about respect. The influence of the Oversight Committee's work spread slowly but steadily. As airports in neighboring regions observed the decrease in complaints and the increase in passenger satisfaction at Ravenport, they reached out to Malcolm for guidance. He found himself fielding calls from airport directors he had never met and speaking on panels about ethics in transportation. The scope of his work expanded beyond fuel contracts into policy advocacy, a role he had never envisioned for himself. One afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from the mayor of Ferndale. "Mr. Rowan," the mayor began, his tone respectful, "we're forming a task force to address fairness in city transportation. Your expertise would be invaluable." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, surprised yet honored. "I appreciate the offer," he replied. "Let me think about how I can contribute without neglecting my current responsibilities." He consulted Ethan and Calvin, both of whom saw the value in bridging private experience with public policy. After careful thought, Malcolm agreed to serve as an advisor, stipulating that his role would remain focused on practical improvements rather than politics. Meanwhile, he channeled his frustration from the incident into a constructive venture. He established the Rowan Scholarship, named for his grandfather, to support young men from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation and logistics. The scholarship not only provided tuition but paired students with mentors from Azure Skies and other industry partners. The first cohort gathered in the company's auditorium, a group of bright-eyed students listening intently as Malcolm spoke. "We need you," he told them. "We need your ideas, your energy, and your commitment to fairness. This industry thrives when it reflects the diversity of the world it serves." Nolan took charge of the scholarship's logistics, visiting schools, answering questions, and sharing Malcolm's story as proof that perseverance could overcome barriers. Gabriel organized a series of public talks where Malcolm discussed the intersection of business and ethics. Attendees included CEOs, line workers, students, and local leaders. Eldon chronicled the impact of the scholarship's first year, interviewing recipients who credited the program with giving them access to opportunities they might never have imagined. Within Azure Skies, Ronan Holt's demeanor changed. Perhaps chastened by the board meeting, perhaps inspired by the company's evolving culture, he began to engage actively in the scholarship program. He reached out to contacts in other firms to secure internship placements for students and participated in mentorship sessions. Malcolm noticed the change and chose to welcome it. He believed that inclusion required forgiveness and that growth often emerged from past mistakes. He invited Ronan to join the Scholarship Advisory Board, a gesture that signaled trust and encouraged accountability. As the company's reputation for integrity grew, so did its business. New contracts came not just from their superior service but from partners who valued ethical leadership. Malcolm's days grew longer, his calendar filling with meetings that ranged from negotiation to mentorship. Yet he found energy in the work. He watched as scholarship recipients visited the airport, eyes wide as they toured control towers, maintenance hangars, and flight simulators. He listened as they asked questions about aerodynamics, logistics, and leadership. He saw in them the potential to transform the industry further. At home, Malcolm's nephew Marlon idolized him. The boy would climb onto his lap and ask, "Uncle Malcolm, why did the airport stop you that day?" Malcolm would explain in simple terms about unfair treatment and the importance of speaking up. "But you're not mad anymore?" Marlon would ask. Malcolm would smile. "I was upset, but I decided to turn that feeling into something good." He promised Marlon that one day he would show him the airport and all the changes that had taken place. Marlon's eyes would shine, and he would ask if he could fly planes when he grew up. "Maybe you'll manage the fuel like me," Malcolm would tease. Those conversations reminded Malcolm why he continued to push for change. The smell of jet fuel and polished floors greeted Malcolm as he and Marlon stepped into Ravenport International, hand in hand. It had been 2 years since the day Malcolm was detained, and the familiar terminal seemed both the same and entirely new. The bustling travelers, the announcements echoing overhead, and the lines at the coffee kiosks were familiar sights. But there was a different energy in the air, more relaxed, more respectful. They approached the security checkpoint. Officer Grant, now with a few more lines on his face and a softer demeanor, was directing passengers with practiced efficiency. He looked up and recognition sparked in his eyes. "Mr. Rowan," he said, stepping forward. "It's good to see you." There was no hint of the dismissiveness from 2 years prior. His voice carried warmth and humility. Malcolm nodded. "Good morning, officer," he replied. He introduced Marlin, who peered up shyly. Grant crouched slightly to be at the boy's eye level. "You've got a great uncle," he said, earning a small smile from Marlin. Supervisor Harris was there too, clipboard in hand. He approached with a nod. "We've learned a lot since that day," he said, his tone genuine. Malcolm studied him for a moment and saw no defensiveness, only a willingness to acknowledge past mistakes. "I appreciate that," Malcolm said. "Growth is what matters." Derek, the young officer who had spoken up in training sessions, joined them. "Mr. Rowan," he said, extending a hand, "I wanted to thank you. The training changed how I approach not just my job but my life outside of work." Moving through the checkpoint smoothly, Malcolm pointed out posters on the walls to Marlin, announcements about the scholarship program, infographics about bias awareness, and photographs from training sessions. "Did you do this?" Marlin asked in awe. Malcolm laughed softly. "I helped," he said, "but many people worked together to make this happen." In the departure lounge, the seats were nearly full. A man reading a business magazine looked up, recognized Malcolm, and walked over. "Sir," he said, "after hearing your story, I reported an issue I saw at another airport. They actually took action. I wanted to thank you." Malcolm shook his hand, heartened that others were empowered to speak. When boarding time came, Malcolm and Marlin approached the gate with their passes. The agent scanned them without incident, smiling as she handed them back. Marlin tugged Malcolm's sleeve. "Is this where they stopped you?" he whispered. "Yes," Malcolm answered. "But today, everything is different." They walked down the jet bridge, and Marlin's excitement bubbled over. "I can't wait to see the clouds up close," he exclaimed. Malcolm chuckled. "You will." As the plane lifted off, Marlin pressed his face to the window. The city shrank below them. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, memories flooding him. He thought of the humiliation and anger of that day, the exhaustion of the boardroom battles, and the satisfaction of seeing change unfold. He thought of Nolan's diligence, Calvin's loyalty, Ethan's wisdom, and even Ronan's transformation. He looked at Marlin's wide-eyed wonder and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt light flickered off. Malcolm unbuckled and let out a slow breath. He turned to Marlin. "You know," he said, "there was a time when I didn't feel welcome here." Marlin frowned. "Why?" he asked. Malcolm looked out the window. "Because sometimes people make mistakes or judgments that hurt others. But what matters is that we try to fix them." Marlin nodded, absorbing the lesson. "I'm glad you fixed it," he said simply. Malcolm smiled and placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder. He realized that he was no longer weighed down by anger. Instead, he was buoyed by purpose and gratitude. The airport, once a symbol of indignity, had become a place where he could teach Marlin about resilience, fairness, and dreams. As the plane glided through the sky, he allowed himself to enjoy the view, the layers of clouds tinged with sunlight, the vastness that mirrored the potential he felt in his nephew's life and in the industry he had helped change. The airport where he once felt small had become a place where he could proudly teach a child to dream big. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows of Malcolm's office, illuminating the letters spread across his desk. Each one had been handwritten by a scholarship recipient, thanking him for an opportunity that had changed their life. He picked up one and traced the words with his finger, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Photographs lined the shelves, young men in caps and gowns, technicians beside aircraft, logistics managers at port terminals. They were the faces of the future he had helped shape. Azure Sky's logistics buzzed with activity. The company had continued to grow steadily, its reputation for integrity acting as a magnet for partners. Clients valued not only their reliability but the way they treated employees and communities. Malcolm had been approached multiple times to run for public office, to take positions that would have broadened his influence. Each time he had declined politely. He felt his impact was greatest where he was, combining business acumen with advocacy and philanthropy. He continued to serve on the Transportation Fairness Task Force, attending monthly meetings where he advocated for policies that balance safety with respect. The work was often slow, incremental change measured in updated protocols and committee reports, but he believed in the process. He remembered the frustration of being ignored by Supervisor Harris and saw how far they had come when Harris himself presented new guidelines that prioritized fair treatment. On a quiet afternoon, Eldon and Gabriel visited. "It's time you wrote it down," Eldon said, waving a notebook. "Your story. Others can learn from it." Malcolm laughed. "You've been saying that for years," he replied. But later that evening, he sat at his desk and began to write. The words flowed. Childhood memories, the morning of the flight, the sting of suspicion, the heartbreak of the missed flight, the resolve that followed. He wrote about Calvin's fierce support, Nolan's diligence, Ethan's counsel, and even about Ronan's attempted sabotage and subsequent redemption. He emphasized not his own heroism but the collective effort required to create change. A knock at his door interrupted his writing. Calvin entered, holding a folder. "Final report from the Oversight Committee," he said. "Complaints are down 75% over 5 years." Malcolm accepted the folder, felt its weight, and looked up at his friend. They exchanged a smile, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had undertaken together. Moments later, Nolan arrived with Marlon, now a tall young man with a confident stride. "Uncle," Marlon said, "I got into the University of Ferndale. Full scholarship." Malcolm's heart swelled. "That's wonderful," he said, embracing him. "Will you come work with me this summer?" Marlon nodded eagerly. "I want to learn everything." As the day ended, Malcolm turned off the lights in his office and walked toward the entrance. In the lobby, a bronze plaque caught the gleam of the setting sun. It bore a quote from his grandfather. "Integrity is the fuel that keeps us moving forward." Malcolm ran his hand over the letters, feeling the cool metal under his palm. He stepped outside, the crisp evening air filling his lungs. The distant hum of aircraft engines vibrated through the air. A sound that had once brought frustration now filled him with peace. He looked up at the sky. Trails of planes crisscrossed overhead, weaving patterns against the fading light. Each contrail was a reminder of the journeys taking place, journeys made safer and fairer through the work he and others had done. He thought of the countless men who had supported him, argued with him, and learned with him. He thought of the young men writing their own letters, beginning their own careers, carrying forward the values he had fought for. As he walked to his car, he felt content. There were still challenges ahead, systems to improve, and people to empower, but he was confident in the path. He had transformed a moment of humiliation into a movement that touched lives he might never meet. He could close this chapter of his story with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that his choice to speak up had made a difference not just for himself, but for many. He closed the chapter knowing that the future could be different because he had dared to speak when silence was easier. They pulled him aside, and moments later, realized he could ground every plane in the network. If you believe arrogance always runs out of gas, subscribe now. Because justice doesn't wait for clearance, it takes off. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, prejudice, and the irony that often exposes ignorance in positions of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on equality, accountability, and treating every person with respect, no matter their appearance or status.